So we're really excited to have one of MidCoast's longtime partners here, Laura Brophy, who is the director of the Institute for Applied Ecology Estuary Technical Group. She has worked up and down the coast. I doubt there's an estuary on the coast that Laura has not been up to her knees in mud and her waders in. And she most recently has worked with MidCoast on our Landward Migration Zones study, completed in 2017, looking at where these future tidal wetlands are going to move to with sea level rise. And oh, sorry, my neighbor's at the door. Hold on. And that's my dog. Hey, Tahoma, come here. Sorry about that. So, Tahoma, come here. Okay, that was exciting. All right, so I'm going to stop blabbing there and let Laura take control of the screen sharing. And want you all to welcome Laura Brophy. Thank you, Laura. I'm sorry about the mayhem.
That was kind of fun. Those are the joys of Zoom meetings, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I saw somebody else's dog earlier too, so I do not have a dog to display. I'm sorry to tell you.
That's probably a good thing.
So yeah, I've been working with the MidCoast for 25 years. I added it up today on the calculator, so that's pretty amazing. I think it was Fran Reck that pulled me into a project back in the late 90s. So it's a long relationship, and I'm very grateful to the MidCoast for the amazing work that you all do. So thank you all. And thank you all for coming to hear my talk. So this is neat that this slides into the revision of the estuary management plan, and I hope the information that I'm presenting will be useful. I know some of the folks involved in that, besides the ones right here, have been to one or two other talks that I've given. Yeah, besides directing the Estuary Technical Group, I'm also on the faculty at CEOS, the College of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences at OSU. And so I've been part of the Marine Resource Management program there for, I would guess, about as long as I've been working with the MidCoast. And this talk tonight, I'm going to be drawing from a whole bunch of different projects. So I won't go through all these neat little logos at the bottom, but suffice it to say, I'm very grateful to all these different organizations. And also, I'm very grateful to Dave Pitkin, who is no longer with us, who took this spectacular photo of Pool Slough, which I think you'll see kind of all over the place these days. And so let's see, there's my clicker. I'm going to go through these main topics today: dynamics of the estuary, both natural and human-driven, and human impacts in particular, both in the past and then how they've affected the estuary's functions of the current time, and then what we think may be happening in the future, and again how that can affect the functions that we care about of tidal wetlands, and then actions that we can take to help mitigate some of the concerns over future impacts. And I'm going to focus on 4 major types of wetlands. So the tidal marsh is the most familiar to most of us. The high marsh at the upper left of this slide, and then the low marsh at the lower left of the slide. And those are easy to see, but what you don't easily see in the landscape is the forested and shrub tidal wetlands. They're less obvious. They look more like other coastal forests, but they are very strong interest right now, and you'll learn why during my talk. So starting with dynamics of the estuary. This is an extremely dynamic place naturally and due to human activities. And I'm going to talk about a few different scales on which it is dynamic, like the geologic time scale across hundreds or thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. And then sort of the 100-year-ish scale, centennial scale, where people have come into the picture and started having impacts like climate change. And at the annual scale, the seasonal rainfall we have and storms, and then the monthly scales of tide, spring and neap tide cycles, and then on the daily scale, the semi-diurnal tides we have, each of which plays a role in how the estuary functions. So starting with the tectonics, the big earthquakes that happen due to the presence of this large fault off the Oregon coast, and the land uplift that has been occurring as the fault is not slipping, and things are kind of, land is piling up against the other plate, and then as it slips, we can have subsidence causing the land surface to drop suddenly. In this case, this picture is taken up in Alaska, and those trees that are all dead in this photo were a living forest before they had the big 1964 earthquake, and then they died. So that was a sort of you can think of it as ultra rapid sea level rise. And if and when we have a big earthquake on the Oregon coast, we could have subsidence like this, and we don't know quite how much or exactly where, but it's a topic to keep in mind. It's sort of in the back of your head as we think about the dynamics of our estuaries. And across a smaller time scale, just the last 100 or 200 years, people, of course, have had a big impact on the estuary. So here you're seeing the familiar view of the mouth of the Yaquina River and the bridge going across the river there, and the town of Newport and South Beach and the marina. And as you move up estuary, there are other kinds of impacts besides those development and fill activities. There's also agriculture, and the Boone Slough, Newt Slough complex here is one of the prime examples. Again, this photo is by Dave Pitkin, and you can see Newport in the background and the bay, and the tide gates at the mouths of these sloughs that have created conditions suitable for agriculture, grazing in this case, and hay production. And then further up the estuary, there's other kinds of development impacts like the mills in Toledo and the associated settling ponds and so forth, and other industrial activities right around the edges of the river that have affected tidal wetlands. Now, of course, one of the biggest impacts we're concerned about right now with climate change is sea level rise. And I'll go into details on this in a moment, but right now, just suffice it to say there's a lot of uncertainty. You all have seen projections like this before, and the flaring out of that curve of where sea level might be in 50 years or 100 years tells us we have a lot to learn still. And then I want to just move into sort of the seasonal dynamics that we'll be talking about rainfall and storms. And thanks to Roy Lowe for this beautiful photo of a winter storm rolling in. We've all experienced that one. And some of them, both winter storms and winter storm surges, which raise the water level, can combine with high tides, and also just the tides themselves can create what we call king tides. And the King Tide Project has taken amazing photos with many people's cooperation and assistance of these high tides. And this is a photo of a January 2015 high tide in Toledo. You can see how high the water is here. If you were to zoom in, it's pretty scary how close the water level of the river is to the top of the dikes that are protecting the river from some of these industrial site materials. So one of the factors too, when we look at seasonal rainfall, is just the topography of our coast. We have a really steep coastal landscape, as you all know. You just go a little ways up estuary and are looking at these narrow valleys. And the water, as it rushes down through these steep coastal watersheds, it carries big pulses of water and sediment into the estuary. And so on a big tide, it can look kind of like this. This was taken in the Coquille estuary. And you can see how much sediment is being carried in the water during this king tide event. And that sediment can either spread across the landscape and contribute to the development and the resilience of a tidal wetland, or it can be channeled out between dikes to the ocean, and it'll flow out into the near shore in that case. So how we've manipulated the landscape has a big impact on what happens to all this sediment. So on the short time scale, the monthly and weekly and daily time scales, I'm sure you've seen diagrams like this before, showing the monthly tide cycle with the full moon and the new moon tides being the spring tides, and then the quarter moons having the less extreme neap tides. And then on the daily cycle, you get the higher high and the lower high. And all these things interact to make the estuary complicated. And so I wanted to show you an example of that from the Tillamook Bay Estuary. And we've done quite a bit of work here. This red circle at the bottom here is a site we call Bay Marsh, and it's a natural tidal marsh. And we put out some data loggers there to measure salinity and water levels. And at the top, you can see a salinity graph. And I should point out first the time scale. This is 3 weeks, I think, from early October to late October of 2014. And what happened, of course, is rain started in mid-October. You started seeing rainfall. That's this third graph here. And the river responded. You start seeing the river flow jump up from just less than 100 cubic feet per second into the thousands here. So how does all that rainfall affect salinity at this wetland that's right at the edge of the bay? And the effect is it goes from being mesohaline, both at the low and high tides. And by the way, this graph doesn't continue to the bottom because the data logger was out of water during the low tide. So you're just seeing the salinity of the tides as they inundate the data logger. But then as the rainfall kicks in, the salinities drop. And high salinities on high tides go from being in the mid to upper 20s down into the teens. So salinity can vary just within a couple week period. And then salinity varies on a daily basis with each tide as well. It goes up with the high tide and down with the low tide because, because at low tide, the freshwater flows are pushing out. And so the water just gets fresher naturally. And this water level graph is just here to kind of show you how the peak salt corresponds to the peak tide. So that's to say it's complicated. So when someone makes a statement like, if you don't want to have methane production because you're concerned about greenhouse gases, you should choose a tidal wetland to restore that has salinity of more than 18. I've literally heard people say that. You need salinity more than 18. So I always ask them, when does the salinity need to be more than 18 and for how long and with what pattern? Because it's never just a single number for very long. So we're kind of trying to figure out how we can deal with this dynamic issue as we study blue carbon, for instance, and carbon storage and methane release from the soil, which, by the way, I will get back to if you're not familiar with that. But I just wanted to show this graph from a different project where we looked at soil salinity as opposed to the salinity of the water in the channel, and they're really different. They tend towards sort of they'll reach an equilibrium over time, but because the system is so dynamic, it takes time to reach that equilibrium. So here you see in red the channel water salinity bumping up and down with every single tide cycle and also changing and dropping as the fall rains kick in. Meanwhile, the soil salinity in the low marsh has been rising all summer, and we're at late September at the left side of this graph going into late November, so it's a 2-month period. And the soil salinity in the low marsh has been climbing throughout the summer, and it continues to climb in October, and then it starts to drop very gradually as you head into the winter rains, but it doesn't drop very fast. Look how different that really is almost flat through that period where the rainfall has really kicked in. And the same is true for the high marsh salinities. They aren't as high as the low marsh salinity, but they're a lot more stable than salinities in the channels, and they respond more slowly to changes like rainfall. And so we think that the groundwater salinities or soil salinity is basically kind of the same thing, will help us a lot more when it comes to figuring out whether a particular wetland might produce methane, for instance. So we've been trying hard to get these soil salinities measured. So how about these human impacts rather than just talking about these natural dynamics? I want to get into some of this question of what's happening with people in the estuary. So Yaquina Bay, as you all know, flows past Toledo, past Boone Slough, Newt Slough, Pool Slough, and then out through the bay, and there's Newport. It's a big and complicated place. And what it looked like a couple hundred years ago gives us a baseline for understanding the effect that people have had. And this is a map that we generated through PMEP's assistance. That's the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Fish Habitat Partnership. And it's a West Coast wide group that I've worked with for about 10 years now, I think. And PMEP sponsors a bunch of research and mapping and on the ground work to enhance fish habitat in our estuaries and nearshore. And others on this call today also are working with PMEP. It's a good group. So this map shows what tidal wetlands looked like back in the mid to late 1800s before there was very much alteration like diking. And the colored areas on this map, again, we're looking at the river flowing past Toledo here and down through the bay. And the colored areas indicate areas that are within tide range right now. And they were also within tide range 100 years ago because sea level hasn't changed very much yet. So the yellowish or sort of orange colored areas are areas that were tidal marsh back then, and the green areas were either shrub or forested tidal swamp. So the Yaquina Estuary didn't have a ton of tidal swamp compared to some estuaries, but it had some substantial areas like these little estuary tributary streams where salinities were higher just due to inflows, or they were farther from the tidal river and they were fresher. Those were some areas where there were some tidal swamps. And this is what the Yaquina looks like today. And I've changed all the areas that are diked off and don't receive tidal influence to red. So the red areas are diked and are no longer tidal wetlands. And what's left is primarily the tidal marsh. So that's interesting. And there's not as much of the tidal marsh left as we would like, but there is definitely tidal marsh left. You can see we've lost 22% of, we've only got 22% of the tidal marsh left in the Yaquina compared to what was there historically. It's a lot worse situation for the forested and shrub tidal swamps. We've lost 92% of the forested and 95% of the shrub. So those are all these figures, by the way, are coming from the study that is, there's a link here at the lower right in this slide, and I'll make sure to get the MidCoast, the PDF of my talk too, so that you could download that and just click on these links in order to get to these reports. So the Yaquina is not alone in having lost most of its tidal swamps. Coastwide, for the whole outer coast of Oregon, historically, out of all the tidal wetlands present in the 1800s, about 58% was swamp. So swamp was the majority of tidal wetlands in Oregon, and that was true in the Columbia River as well. 42% was marsh, and not that much was mapped as shrub swamp specifically. Nowadays, there's very little of that swamp left. As I mentioned, 95% loss, so only about 18% of the forested and shrub wetlands are left. So, I'm sorry, 18% of the current what tidal wetlands are swamp, not very many. So just to give you a little sense of what the Yaquina Bay tidal marsh and swamp looked like before all these big changes. So again, here's this photo that Dave Pitkin took of Pool Slough, and this is for the least disturbed system that really shows what a natural tidal marsh looks like. In terms of tidal swamp, this is from the Yaquina upstream of Toledo. And that's a big Sitka spruce on the left overhanging this tidal channel. And this is pretty typical of what these swamps would have looked like. Here's a couple more pictures from this same site. There's a lot of large wood lying on the ground and in the channels, buried underneath sediment that gets deposited during flood events and during daily high tides. Very complicated, tangled vegetation, difficult to work in. And this is from the Nehalem, but it's to give you a little bigger picture of what it would have looked like from one of the channels. This is another Sitka spruce tidal swamp, and I'll bet you would have seen tidal swamps much like this up Depot Slough, for example, back in the 1800s. This is another photo from the Siuslaw tidal swamp upriver there. It's very fresh. This one, you can tell because of all the skunk cabbage. Does not like salt water. But spruce can handle salt water, by the way. Not a ton of it, but they can handle up into the teens, which is pretty interesting and actually was not known until we started measuring salinities in the swamps back about 10, 15 years ago. So what you're seeing in this photo, this is back in the Nehalem again, that same swamp on the Nehalem, and this is actually a low beaver dam. The beaver have just piled some sticks in here. It's not a well-built dam, but they have succeeded in creating a pool behind the dam. And so it's also an area that's heavily populated by otters and elk and bear and very rich wildlife. And this is a shrub tidal swamp in the Yaquina. Pacific crabapple is a salt-tolerant shrub that it will grow in these brackish areas. And here's one with twinberry in the foreground, and I think some willows in the background. So both of those can handle quite a bit of salt as well. So these are kind of unique environments that we have in the Northwest. Salt-tolerant woody wetlands. So what happened to all these tidal swamps? And inquiring minds have answered this question. Dikes and tide gates are a lot of what happened to the tidal swamps, as you might guess. Depot Slough is an example. So up Depot Slough, okay, so I should start at the beginning. Here's the mouth of Depot Slough with the tide gates. And as you move up through the system, this part of Depot Slough was actually tidal marsh historically, the lower portion. And we know that from the historical maps that people have created with great effort, which are very useful. But then as you moved up this system into fresher water, there were forested swamps found in the Depot Slough area. And that's actually where a high percentage of the historical swamps was up Depot Slough. And those tide gates at the mouth of Depot Slough, I have not seen them myself, so I'm not sure which of these two they look more like, but I think they're probably more the gravity operated tide gates, and someone can correct me in the chat if I'm wrong about that. This tide gate on the left is a gravity operated flap gate. It just hangs down by its weight. And when there's enough water behind, it opens up and lets that water out. But when the tides come up on the outside, it can't open and it stays shut. But another more advanced type of tide gate is shown on the right with a flap that is controlled by a system of floats and can be partially open much of the tide cycle. And so those are often installed to assist with fish access to these tidal wetlands. But one thing to remember with these new style tide gates, like this type I think is called a muted tide regulator, they do provide better fish access for sure, but they don't restore the full set of natural processes that we are really going to rely on in the future for our tidal wetlands to keep pace with sea level rise. Tidal wetlands need tidal inundation carrying sediment on a regular basis to replenish their sediment and keep them, let them equilibrate with rising sea levels. So getting back to what happened to the tidal swamps, logging is a part of the picture for sure. It went along with dike construction and tide gates. And one of the reasons that logging was very much valued was because during World War I, Sitka spruce was one of the best woods for making aircraft that were needed for military operations. So there was an entire division of the Army devoted to spruce production in the Northwest. And the spruce production division logged a lot of spruce, which contributed to the American war effort. And oops, I missed one there. The spruce that were growing near rivers, like in tidal swamps, were easier to transport than a lot of other trees that were farther away from the rivers. They could just be dropped near the river, brought into the river, and then they would come down the river and be milled at probably often near the mouth. So these log drives on the river were a really big deal back then, as you all probably know. And that cleared land where the spruce were cut then was able to be converted to agriculture. So the logging and the clearing went hand in hand with development of agriculture in the coastal area. So these big changes to our estuaries are important because they had effects on the functions and the conditions of tidal wetlands. And these functions are also sometimes called ecosystem services, and they're a lot of why we really care about these tidal wetlands. And how did these losses and changes to the tidal wetlands affect their conditions and their functions? These are a few of the different functions, and you've probably all heard about a lot of these. Excuse me. Fish and wildlife habitat is one of the important functions of tidal wetlands. Food web support is kind of part of that, contributing food for these organisms and then exporting it out into the river and the bay and the near shore. Carbon sequestration is something you'll hear a lot about these days and in the future, I expect. Carbon stored in tidal wetland soils is reliably stored for the long term because these soils are saturated and will remain saturated into the future. So carbon doesn't burn off from a saturated soil, it stays put pretty generally. And so carbon storage can help slow climate change. So we're very interested in that. And then flood reduction, that's just as water comes down the system, if there's a tidal wetland connected to the river and it's not diked off, then the floodwaters can spread out and dissipate across the tidal wetland and not cause havoc downstream. So that's been a big function of tidal wetlands. And then water quality. Plants in tidal wetlands can soak up excess nutrients as well as toxins and heavy metals and things to keep them out of the water supply and keep them out of the bodies of fish and other wildlife. And then sediment stabilization, that same thing where I was talking about sediment coming in and being deposited on the wetlands is important because it keeps that sediment out of the bay, and then people don't have to dredge the bay as often. And then water temperature moderation. Wetlands are always good at that. Water flows through the soil instead of on the surface in a wetland. And that helps cool it because it's shaded in the soil. It's interesting to think of water flowing through the soil, but it does very slowly. So I want to focus in on two of these functions that we have been learning a lot about recently. These are kind of new areas of study, but very important. One is salmon habitat and the other is carbon sequestration. So you're going to be basically seeing breaking news here. So starting with the salmon habitat question, some of the unique characteristics of tidal swamps, that is these forested tidal wetlands, they have deep and really complicated tidal channels. You saw how much large wood was in those channels in that photo I showed you from the swamp in the Yaquina. The channels are just full of wood. In fact, quite often there's so much wood and material dropped on top of the wood and piles of wood that the channel just disappears underground for a while. I was trying to map a channel down in the Siuslaw, and I couldn't crawl through the tube. So I had to try to figure out where it started and where it came out. And honestly, I really couldn't. It was too complicated. And then abundant large woody debris has its own benefits in terms of producing salmon prey, for instance, and giving shelter for salmon from predators. And then low tide refuge is because all that large wood and all the complexity of the channels means that the channels generally don't empty at low tide. So the fish have a place to hang out instead of being washed out into the river, which is really good in a storm situation where they otherwise might get washed down into the bay and be subjected to salinity that they're not ready for yet. So for young salmon, low tide refuge is really important. And beaver ponds are part of that picture too. Beaver are very active in the tidal swamps. There's lots of food for them. It's easier for them to key in dams to the large woody debris. So beaver are a very important piece of the ecosystem picture. And then because these tidal swamps form in the less salty part of the estuary, there are adjustment opportunities for young salmon that aren't ready to enter the saltiest parts of the estuary yet. And they're gradually trying to adjust to salt. And often tidal swamps might have brackish water near the river or brackish water at high tide. But at low tide, the water will be fresher, and up near the hill slope, the water will be fresher. And so fish are able to just move around within a single site to find the spot that has the salinity that they're okay with. And that's pretty amazing that there are places like that where fish can find those benefits. And then all the time that they're in the tidal swamp, they have the benefit of the high energy prey production. And I'll get into that in a moment in more detail. So one of the big things that I think is neat that people are becoming aware of is that salmon don't just live in tidal channels. You've probably seen the meme, that salmon live in parking lots or something like that, but this is literal. They do live on the tidal marsh. When the tide is high and the surface of the marsh is inundated, the salmon will come out and forage on the surface of the marsh. This was what Greg Hood said in 2018 at a conference. Greg Hood and his colleagues. Salmon habitat is not just tidal channels, it's also tidal marsh. And as we've learned more about these other types of tidal wetlands, the swamps, we can expand that to just say salmon habitat is tidal wetlands as well as channels, including swamps. So then to get into this question of the high energy prey production, this is pretty neat. This is work that Isa Wu and her colleagues up at the Nisqually River Estuary in Puget Sound have done. And this title is long, but it kind of says it perfectly, a mosaic of estuarine habitat types with prey resources, that would be generally insects and crustaceans, from multiple environmental strata, like, let's say, grasses, shrubs, and trees, and mud and channels, supports a diversified foraging portfolio, i.e. a big menu with a lot of choices for juvenile Chinook. And it's that diversity of that menu that allows fish to also have a diversity of life history patterns, and that gives them resilience. So to get into a couple details, because they're really fun for geeks like me, is here's a graph. It's a non-metric multidimensional scaling, that's NMDS graph, showing what basically you do is you take a bunch of data points and you put them into a model, and it spits out this image showing how these data points relate to each other. And so when you see clusters of data points, there's some meaning to that cluster. And so these dots here, the colored dots you see, represent individual fish or small numbers of fish that they captured and looked at their diet, their gut contents. And similar gut contents within different fish result in dots that are close together. So you can see that, and these names of different groups of prey, salmon prey, indicate where those prey were in terms of what the fish were eating. It's a little hard to explain, but a fish represented by this yellow dot here was eating insects. And a fish represented by this purple dot over here was eating mysids, which are kind of like small shrimp. And so fish up here were eating amphipods, which are other crustaceans. So this graph just kind of tells a big story, a complicated story in an interesting way. And besides the insect parts of the graph showing where different insects are, they call these centroids. You can also put down centroids of different habitat types. So EEL in this graph right here means eelgrass, DMF means mudflat, EEM means salt marsh, EFT means brackish marsh, which is just a little bit higher marsh. And then tidal forest is over here. And so this shows the kind of prey that fish were eating in these different habitat types. So in forest, salmon were eating insects, almost, I wouldn't say exclusively, but their diet really tended heavily towards insects, which are actually considerably higher energy prey compared to crustaceans, I guess, because they don't have as much of a shell. You can imagine a nice juicy fly larva, for instance. And then these fish over here that were eating those crustaceans, amphipods and mysids, those are the diets of fish that are living in eelgrass and mudflats. And fish living in marsh are eating something in between, a mix of insects and crustaceans. So it's a pretty neat way to look at the data. And the story that it tells is there's a couple different stories. Melanie Davis wrote a separate paper in 2018 documenting that the tidal forests that they studied actually provided this higher quality food that had higher modeled growth potential, high energy content to that insect diet in the forests compared to other estuary habitats. So that's a neat piece of information. And then the conclusion from Wu's study was basically the timing and the productivity and the diversity of prey across all these different habitat types in the Nisqually. That's what determines an estuary's capacity to support many different life history strategies among fish. So a diverse habitat portfolio means a diverse fish population and a resilient fish population. And others have stated this slightly differently. Corey Green's group, doing some work up in Puget Sound, also said habitat diversity is important for maximizing juvenile salmon growth opportunity, and therefore restoration planning should focus on habitat diversity as well as capacity to support the recovery and resilience of our salmon populations. So this is something we're increasingly aware of, is how we've lost certain habitats and the effects that has on fish habitat functions and fish population resilience. And then the second function that I wanted to talk about a little is carbon sequestration. It's kind of a hot topic right now. So how would carbon sequestration vary among these different wetland types that I'm talking about, the high marsh, the low marsh, and the forested tidal swamp, and then the shrub tidal swamp? Which of these is going to store the most carbon? I guess before I get into that, I should explain what we mean by blue carbon or carbon sequestration. So this is a picture of a tidal marsh, and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is taken up by plants during photosynthesis, and it's stored inside the bodies of the plants and then also transferred into the soil either through the roots or when the plant decomposes and all the carbon that was in it is then in the soil. And either it's on top of the soil and it gets buried by that incoming sediment that I mentioned, another reason we need sediment, or the roots themselves when they decompose are already in the soil. So the other thing that can happen to carbon besides being stored in the soil is it can be released, and it is released as a natural part of the photosynthesis cycle. During respiration, plants release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, but not as much as they take up, because they grow by storing carbon in their tissues. And methane can be released as well, and methane is a concern because it's a pretty potent greenhouse gas. It contributes to global warming. So we're interested in methane, and we're measuring how much methane is released from different habitat types. And so let's look a little at the carbon storage in the soils. And we were lucky enough to have an opportunity to study 37 sites in the Pacific Northwest, from Northern Cal up through Puget Sound, and to get a handle on how this carbon storage might vary from one wetland type to another. And Boone Kaufman was the lead author on this 2020 publication. And this is one of the graphs showing how much carbon, megagrams of carbon per hectare, is stored by seagrasses. These are both figures from our own study and figures from global studies. So we're kind of fitting our fitting our study sites into this picture. So the Pacific Northwest seagrasses come out a little higher than the global average. Pacific Northwest high marsh comes out high compared to all global marsh averages. The low marsh was a little lower. And then we get over to the forested wetlands here, and it's like, oh my gosh, they really stored a lot of carbon in their soil. They also stored quite a lot of carbon above ground in the tree biomass, which is a lot of what you hear about with upland forests. So they have the benefit of both below ground and above ground carbon storage. And tidal forests are on a par with the highest carbon storing ecosystems on Earth, which previously were considered to be the mangroves, but we're learning that our Northwest forests store as much or more carbon than the mangroves. So very important information. This is a comparison of our forested tidal wetland carbon storage and high marsh carbon storage to some of the different forest figures from old growth forest on the coast of Oregon and Washington, and then some of the upland non-old growth forests. And you can see that, again, the tidal forested wetlands stack up very high. They're comparable to the old growth forest, which is, it's pretty amazing. So in terms of impacts and dynamic change, we can't avoid talking about sea level rise. How will climate change and sea level rise in particular affect our tidal wetlands? And thanks to the MidCoast, we were able to do a study back that, as Evan mentioned, finished up in 2017 to model how sea level rise may affect our tidal wetlands across the whole coast of Oregon. And the website at the MidCoast has lots of good information about this project. And then we also have the report online here at this link. And again, I'll provide this PDF so you can jump to these locations easily. The funding for this project came from OWIB and from Fish and Wildlife Service's coastal program. And the Estuary Technical Group did the technical analysis, and I worked with Fran Reck to help spread the word about the results of this project. And we did this project based on the knowledge that tidal wetlands only form in a narrow elevation range. And so this cross-sectional diagram, Joshua Shackley kindly drew because my Sharpie sketch was totally inadequate. And Josh drew, here's the bay, here's the river, the tidal river. There's some mud flat here. And as you go upslope, you get into tidal wetlands, tidal marsh, tidal swamp. They aren't necessarily one higher than the other. That's another story. But in any case, they extend from about mean tide level to the annual high tide line. And then if we get sea level rise, you can imagine that they might have to move upslope because the sea level will be higher then. And that's what we call the Landward Migration Zone, or we call it the LMZ for short. And you can see also that as the slope increases, there's less lateral extent available. So these coastal wetlands with sea level rise may be squeezed into a smaller land area, which is a concern. And we mapped this process by looking at different sea level rise scenarios. And I'll start with 0 centimeters of sea level rise. So this is current conditions. And this map just shows the Yaquina Estuary again with the areas within tide range shown in blue. And the light blue tone is areas that are water or mudflat right now. And the darker blue tone is areas that are in the right elevation range to be vegetated tidal wetlands. So that's the current condition. And now if we have 9 inches or 23 centimeters of sea level rise, you start to see some change. And one of the places you see it is within this diked area where we've had an elevation drop due to loss of organic matter and compaction of the soil and drainage of the soil. And so some of that highly organic soil has lost some of its organic material and the elevation has dropped as a result. So it's kind of low. So you see mudflats creeping in here with just 9 inches of sea level rise. And then with 1.5 feet of sea level rise, more of that area, which is quite subsided, could become mudflat. And again, these are projections based on where we see tidal wetlands currently. It's our best guess. There are also novel ecosystems that form under novel environmental conditions. So we have a lot that we'll be learning over the next few years, I'm sure. 75 centimeters of sea level rise, you see quite a lot of conversion of low subsided areas into mudflat. With a 4.7 foot sea level rise, which is sort of a moderate high scenario for the year 2100, there's a 46% overall loss of tidal wetlands. But one of the issues here is, I should say that's a 46% loss of areas that are at the proper elevation to be tidal wetlands. But you'll notice that a bunch of those areas are right in the city of Toledo. Those aren't going to be future tidal wetlands, most likely. And then we went on to look at a 2.5 meter and a 3.5 meter scenario, which I won't dwell on because it's not a happy picture. But it's an important one to be aware of. It means we have to really give our wetlands a chance, give them a chance to equilibrate with rising sea level, because it's not just about the sea level, it's also about how much sediment can come into these wetlands and help them keep pace with sea level. This is the natural way that tidal wetlands form, is through gradual accretion. With each high tide, a little sediment comes in. And over time, even if sea level changes or rises, they can rise to match, because they get inundated a little more often and a little more sediment comes in. But we don't know quite how this is going to work with rapid accelerated sea level rise. There's been several studies done and they don't all agree. Karen Thorne's group put out a report in 2018 called Marshes to Mudflats, and they studied specific locations. They modeled individual sites across the Northwest. And their conclusion, based on that limited number of sites, was that 83% of those types of areas that they studied would convert to mudflat with that 1.42 meter sea level rise scenario. Our study for the Yaquina specifically found 46% conversion to mudflat of tidal wetlands. I was part of a team. Aaron Peck, who's now in Delaware, led a group studying sediment accretion and long-term carbon sequestration using deep cores from a number of sites. In fact, her study was the most cores ever conducted in the Northwest to date. And we published that in 2020. That seemed a more optimistic result. It looked as if sediment accretion so far is keeping pace with sea level rise, and sediment supply is ample, which sounds good, but that was past sea level rise, and you saw what that curve looked like. So we have some very serious concerns for the future. But this does give us some optimism that with adequate sediment inputs, and if natural sedimentation processes are in place and that sediment can get onto the wetland, at least some of our wetlands may have a fighting chance to keep pace with sea level rise and maintain their functions into the future. So speaking of actions we can take, there are things we can do to help protect the tidal wetlands that we really value into the future, make sure that they can still provide the functions that we care about. And among them are, as you all know, conserving and restoring tidal wetlands. Looking to the future, thinking about tidal wetlands, not just where they are now, but where they might be in the future. And there's been quite a few studies on topics related to this. And so I think it's always really good to make sure we look to the past and understand and use the data that were collected previously and use existing prioritizations to help guide our actions. New information is always coming out, and so we keep adjusting, but we have to make sure we don't lose track of what's been done previously. And then we also have to support and encourage the research that's ongoing to answer burning questions that remain, which we need to answer in order to do a good job on our conservation and restoration work. So as an example of a prioritization, I did one back in 1999, but we've learned some new things since then. So this sea level rise study gave us a chance to bring that into the picture and produce a separate prioritization focused on that factor alone. And this map shows, it's based on a number of different factors, like the size of the landward migration zone that's available, then land ownership and zoning and development status and so forth. And the sites that are blue are higher priority in this scoring regime, and the sites that are red are lower priority, and then the black color is overlaid on impervious surfaces that are unlikely to be suitable for future tidal wetlands. So you can see this map is at the 4.7 foot sea level rise scenario, and you can see that the prioritized areas are upstream, and that's despite there not being much landward migration zone available, but the other factors contributed towards those being higher priority. And then up Depot Slough here, and not quite as high a score for these pool slough wetlands, but you can see around the perimeter of the estuary are some lands that we really do need to be thinking about. And there have been actions taken on the basis of these past prioritizations, and these are some of the MidCoast's actions. These numbers correspond to sites in the 1999 study that I did. And there's also been some mitigation projects along Olalla Slough. All of these have contributed towards restoring tidal wetlands in the Yaquina. And some of these were mapped in this Yaquina Estuary Conservation Plan Atlas that the Wetlands Conservancy produced. So you can get a picture of where some of these sites are located. This was the Y27 site, which I'll get back to in a moment. And then Olalla Slough sites up here. And then this site just north of the airport in Toledo. So good actions have been ongoing, and many of them thanks to the MidCoast. So I'm going to actually zoom to the Y27 site up above Toledo there. And this was back in 2002. We breached the dike there. We took down some of the dike, but we left a lot of the dike as well. It was an early project, really, and funding was limited. But getting the tides back into that site has made a huge difference. And then during a phase 2 restoration that the MidCoast did, this phase 2 project really built on that earlier project. And the emphasis was updated to recognize our current concerns. We wanted to restore that spruce tidal swamp. We want to make sure sediments can get into the site and keep it, give it a fighting chance to keep pace with sea level rise and thus build its resilience to climate change. And I have to say, there was a giant advance in equipment since we did the earlier project. This was a very low ground pressure excavator. I don't know the name for this thing, but it's amazing. Maybe Evan will tell us the name later. Evan and Trevor can tell us. And then large woody debris was placed on the site, and there was channel stability enhancements around the city of Toledo's water line going through the site, and immediate wildlife use by this lovely heron. And channels were excavated at this site to target widths and depths, an engineered project. These were things that we weren't able to do during that earlier project. So it was really an enhancement of the earlier project to build its resilience for the future. And so that MidCoast project is, I think, a good lead into the new ways that we think about restoration today. So when we prioritize restoration efforts now, we're thinking not just about, where we might have an opportunity, but we want to focus on the most impacted habitat types. And in many cases, that is tidal swamp. And we want to prioritize areas with sea level rise resilience. And we're still casting about to figure out where these areas are exactly. I think there's going to be some modeling of sediment movement through the estuaries and areas that are most able to receive adequate sediment. And we also need to make sure we allow other organisms to help us, people, in our jobs. Beaver are a challenge on the landscape for people, but they have a huge role to play as system engineers in detaining sediment and holding sediment in the wetlands and allowing those wetlands to, again, keep pace with sea level rise. So thinking about how we restore tidal swamps, one of the biggest questions is always, what is the appropriate elevation and salinity for planting tidal swamps? And we've only been collecting data on the salinities and elevations of tidal swamps for a decade. So this is still early days, and there's a lot of variety amongst them. But we've got some good information. Here's the crew from 2003 planting on the dike at that Yaquina Y27 site. And those spruce have done very well. These are some of the spruce that were left after the recent project, and big, happy spruce. So clearly that was the right elevation and salinity zone for these trees. And this is a project up on the Siuslaw North Fork. And I want to show you a sequence of pictures from Google Earth showing how successful this was. This is about a 4-acre reed canary grass pasture that had a low dike. and a tide gate on the mouth of a channel here. Mostly, yeah, like I say, reed canary grass, a little willow patch here. And this had all been tidal swamp historically, forested by Sitka spruce. And so that's what we planted, was Sitka spruce. And this is in 2012. So 5 years after restoration, you can really see the dots of the planted spruce here. And then 2016, yes, that's 9 years after restoration, the spruce have grown a lot, very healthy. And 2019 and the spruce are coming close to closing their canopy. The reed canary grass is nearly gone from large parts of the site, and not only the parts where the spruce trees are. So this restoration had, we don't even understand yet why the Pacific lady fern and the giant vetch and the cow parsnip became so dominant across parts of this site that were solid reed canary grass, but they did. And so the restoration of tidal flows, this is not salty at all. It's a totally fresh site. And there's so many unknowns in this work. It's just fascinating. So I mentioned, I think, subsidence after a site is diked and how the land surface can sink and get really wet. And this is an issue with restoration too, as is this very competitive reed canary grass and invasive species. They both interfere with our ability to restore the forested tidal wetlands, but there are some really neat innovative techniques that people are experimenting with. So Jake Robinson has been doing some work in the Coquille and maybe elsewhere now too, with what he calls log cribs, and they're constructed cribs holding soil and bark material, and then spruce are planted inside these cribs, giving them sort of a leg up above this wet reed canary grass area. And the cribs are tied or fastened somehow to posts so that they can actually float up and down in the tide. So a very interesting approach. And I'm really going to be curious to see how it works out in the long term. This was a photo taken 4 years after the plantings in one of these log cribs, and this tree looks healthy. So I guess one of the big questions will be, when it gets its roots down into the soil, does it stabilize and allow a large tree to grow? So it'll be fun to follow that. And here's another approach in the Umpqua. This is Matt Ruwald showing where he's taken a chainsaw and cut slots in this big log so that you can then plant a little spruce in the top of the log, and its roots can get down through the log, through that slot into the soil below. And again, one of the issues will be, will this log roll? You know, we get a big tide event, and if it rolls and breaks off any roots that made it to the soil, that's not going to work. But there are other approaches as well, like building mounds that might provide trees a place to get established, and then they can work their magic with the root platforms and things that spruce trees do to survive wet places. I have a picture of that coming up as well. I have to say, to be cautious about putting soil fill into wetlands as a restoration technique. It's not something that we generally have recommended, but we are trying to think strategically, and if these things are carefully planned and you have good wetland ecologists involved, it can be done in a way that's good. So these innovative restoration methods also can help us with sea level rise adaptation, because they're all ways of dealing with increasing inundation. And we have our partners, Beaver, that build dams, and behind the dams, sediment really piles up. And we have spruce trees which form root platforms which are elevated above the wet ground and allow other plants to grow and generate more biomass. And spruce trees are also very resilient, and they'll fall down and then just regrow from their fallen trunks multiple new trees, contributing to the elevation of the soil and large woody debris and carbon storage in the soil. So all these things are complicated, and so we've been doing research over the years to try to answer all the questions that come up, and these are some of the studies that I've mentioned, which have hot links in the PDF that I will send to you. And we do need more data. We're still collecting data, of course. What scientist would ever say we don't need more data? But we have a lot of burning questions. We need to know more about greenhouse gas exchange if we're going to offer up tidal wetlands as a carbon mitigation, a carbon storage and climate mitigation strategy. And that's being accounted for now financially. We need to be accurate about how much carbon is stored and how much methane is released, and do the accounting properly. And we're doing some research on that right now. We need to understand sediment transport and how it relates to sea level rise resilience. And we need to understand how much our land surfaces are likely to subside. And there have been studies done on that, but we have yet to sort of correlate them with our restoration activities and think about how those two very different kinds of processes interact. And I have to put in a plug for the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, which I'm one of the founding members of. It started back in 2013, and we're working hard to try to answer these questions about carbon storage and greenhouse gas exchange, methane, and so forth. And check out the website if you're interested. So having ticked off all the topics on my roadmap, I hope that I've given you a little tantalizing taste of estuary dynamics and how people have affected the estuary and how that has affected the functions of the tidal wetlands that we really care about, and then what might happen in the future, and then what we can do about it. And I think that we decided that I would probably be able to take some questions, even though it's past 7:30. So let's see what our organizers think. We'll stop sharing.
We definitely have a few minutes here. So thanks, Laura, and thanks everyone for being here. Just a couple follow-ups for questions you laid out for me there during the talk, Laura. The Depot Bay Tide Gate is a big, large swinging door tide gate. We did a comprehensive survey of all the tide gates on the Midcoast a couple years back, and I did include a picture in the chat box there of that big one. So that's there. Big Float is the name of that big excavator. Trevor pointed out it's also just generally known as an amphibious excavator. And thanks to Jeff for putting a link in there to, I think, one of the groups that produces those. It's really cool because for this project, like Laura said, it kind of just spreads out the weight enough that it just really floats right on top of the marsh surface. It can actually float in water and do work from the water. Wow. But during the project, during that Yaquina project, the contractors kind of said, well, we prefer not to work in a river because if your engine goes down, then you just have a very expensive piece of equipment floating downstream. So they mostly work from the marsh surface, but we've shared that contractor contact with our partners at the refuge, the Sluts Refuge, and they're going to be doing some work up in Nestucca that all the work has to be done from the water. And I'll plug that contractor one more time. That was a big part of why that project came in, on budget and on time, is they had the specialized equipment to get the work done to really limit the impact of the actual work. And so we're not just doing the work we want to do for more tidal channels and dike lowering or removal. We're not having to clean up a mess on the way out as well. So that was a big part of making that project a success. And beyond that machine, they had made specialized buckets that had the one-to-one shape. They called it the bat wing. It looked like a big V. And so instead of a square bucket trying to dig a tidal channel that has a kind of one-to-one slope on the side, they have a specialized bucket they've manufactured that they just take one pass, and they've already got that nice slope and perfect slope rather than moving a square excavator bucket around. And yeah, that was really cool to watch that in action for sure. Wow. So I've got just a few questions here.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and remind folks to throw your questions in the chat box that you've had in mind, because there's not too many. As we usually have. I mean, Laura did an amazing job at covering things in great detail, so I'm not surprised. But yeah, there's got to be some more questions out there. Throw them in the chat box, please.
So I start addressing the ones, or do you want to throw them to me? I'll let you throw me questions.
Yeah, we'll throw them to you. So this one might be a tough one, but what % of restoration to be done will be effective? Will have effective habitat for salmon?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I mean, we can probably guess it's proportional. Like if tidal wetlands are vital for salmon and 95% of them are gone, and you bring it back to, increase it by 10%, that would provide 10% of the benefit to salmon that a full restoration would provide. But we aren't able yet to quantify exactly how many fish come from an acre of restoration. There have been folks that have taken a stab at that, but I don't know that I would believe that the results are applicable everywhere. So what can you say? More is better. Funding is always the limitation. We never have the pleasure of being able to say, we don't need to do any more restoration.
Yeah, maybe while we're waiting for a sec, I'll put in one more plug here for some mid-coast projects on the kind of what you're talking about, Jake Robinson and those cribs and then those nurse logs. We've completed a pilot project last summer in Pool Slough on Van Eck property. We did some road grade removal, removing an old road grade from the marsh, but then we started placing a lot of logs in these future tidal wetland in these landward migration zones. And we're actually looking for, we usually, when we're putting wood in a stream, we want that wood to not rot quickly. So we use cedar or spruce or some of the stuff that holds up a long time. We don't use hemlock and some of these other things that rot a little bit quicker, but now we're actually starting to use some of those to put these out as nurse logs, and we want them to rot. We want them to break down quickly and to start building these elevated platforms. So when the tide gets there in 50 to 100 years, you have that kind of intact vegetation to be ready for that big change that's coming. And the other part of that is we are still working on a big glut of logs that we help salvage from the Echo Mountain fire up in Otis. And a lot of those are big, short chunks of logs that aren't great for stream restoration, but we're going to be throwing them all in our estuary areas up above that, current mean high tide line, and just trying to get the vegetation set there to really build that resilience that Laura was talking about.
Yeah, and one fun aspect of that project that we were just doing recently was kind of one other approach similar to like planting trees in the cribs that you mentioned, was finding some of these like natural depressions and some of these more degraded breaking down logs and sprinkling spruce seed into those depressions and packing them with mud and moss and trying to get some germination instead of just trying to plant a tree straight into a log, let the seedling find its way. So it's experimental, but that was fun, and it'll be fun to watch how that goes. Okay, it looks like there's some more questions trickling in. Evan, do you want to go to the next one?
Sure, yeah. Tom asks, are there any examples of forested tidal wetlands to visit?
Oh, yes. Yes, I think the easiest one to access is the Hoquarton Slough Spruce Swamp up in Tillamook. And there's a boat launch just on the west side of 101, just south of the 101 bridge. It's called Sue Elmore Park, the boat launch there. And you can paddle a kayak from there west to go through some really beautiful Sitka spruce tidal swamp. Now there's trees down sometimes because they're spruce and they fall down sometimes. But that's a really good spot to go to. I think it's the easiest. There's a trail on foot as well there where you can go off on the other side of 101 to the east. There's a little park there. I don't remember the name of what they call that little city park there, but there's a small paved trail, and it doesn't really go into the swamp, but you can see the swamp across the channel, across Hoquarton Slough. So that's, I think that's the easiest access of any tidal swamps that I've ever been to. Up on the Columbia River, if you launch your canoe or your kayak at Napa, at the boat dock at Napa, that's KNAPPA, and then paddle east, you'll get into spectacular tidal swamps along Blind Slough, some of the largest remaining tidal swamps in Oregon. So those would be my recommendations.
Great. Go ahead, Trevor.
Yeah, so thanks for that answer. John French asks, who/what is responsible for the creation of all the dikes and tide gates?
Yeah, people had to make a living when they came to the coast, and agriculture was often the way they would make their living. So, and these days as well, people are still making a living from pasture. Often on the Oregon coast, it's pasture, and it might be just winter pasture for cattle. In some areas, it's year-round pasture. In some areas, the diked and tide-gated areas are used for hay production or green chop or silage. So, and even row crops. But these dikes and tide gates serve an economic function. So they are important to our coastal economy. So our job is to figure out what areas are no longer very productive for agriculture and what areas are the highest priority and the landowners are interested and willing in potentially doing a restoration project. So it's a the balancing of the many human interests on the coast. And I think the MidCoast Council is really good at working with landowners. So we can recognize both the value of the tide gates, but also recognize the changes that they have caused that are damaging to the ecosystems. They're both important.
Yep. All right, so Margaret asks, approximately what percentage of priority areas have been restored in the Yaquina? In addition to funding limitations, what other limitations are there that prevent restoration?
Percentage of priority areas, that's an interesting question. I would hazard a guess that it's maybe 10% or 20% of the priority areas that were identified back in that 1999 study. I don't know if that's very accurate, but it's not half, I don't think. But it's not only 2% either. It's somewhere in that middle range. I mean, substantial enough that I'm proud to see what's been done in the Yaquina. And I would say, in addition to funding limitations, usually there are, it's just hard to find a site where all the stars align. The landowner is interested, there's no neighbor that's concerned and stops up the process because they don't want any change to hydrology at all. There's no infrastructure that's at risk. The permits come smoothly and the project can proceed. It takes years and years and years, if not decades, to get these projects rolling. So I guess logistical and social limitations are present as well as funding.
Yeah, I can sense Evan wanting to echo the permitting. Anyways, Paul asks, can you speak about historic splash dams and the implications to stream and estuary conditions? And how about water quality limited streams and the implications to estuaries?
Yeah, splash dams were used, I think, in many coastal watersheds to transport logs. They would log the trees, drop them into the river. Well, okay, let's start at the beginning. They would build a earthen dam to stop up the flow of the river, and then drop trees into the river and hold them there until the spring or the winter rains arrived. And then when the winter rains arrived and the river level came up, they would break the dam, or maybe to some extent the natural increased river flow would break the dam. I need to learn a little more about that history, but in any case, the dam would break and the trees would all come rushing down the river, of course, causing tremendous erosion because all these logs in that channel would just scour away all the non-rock material. So when you see a bare rock riverbed, in some cases, that's the result of historic splash damming, and that creates problems for salmon habitat for sure. I don't know how quickly these rivers can recover from that, and I also don't know how many of the river channels in some parts of the state may have naturally had bare rock beds, but splash damming had an impact for sure. And then water quality limited streams. Yeah, the temperature limitations in particular, I think, have a relationship to wetland restoration, because when all the wetlands alongside the stream are disconnected, whether it's due to downcutting of the stream and downcutting of tributaries, which in turn is due to potentially logging or watershed flow changes. When you have a disconnected floodplain and the wetlands aren't wetlands anymore, water doesn't flow through the wetland to get cooler. Instead, it just comes down the channel. And the water coming through a wetland is cooler. It's just, it's been under the soil. You know how the earth is always cool if you dig down a little bit. So wetlands and tidal wetland restoration and other kinds of wetland restoration can help cool streams and contribute to improvements in water quality for sure.
Well, I think we'll stop there. Trevor, anything else on your side there? I'm good.
I think we're good. Yep.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. That was a great presentation. And like she said, we'll get the PDF and we can send that out so everyone can follow up on all those really interesting links. And then Tom will put the recording up on our website as well for anyone who missed it, and we can pass that, and you can pass that along to anyone else who might be interested. So thanks again, Laura, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Yeah, a little round of
Thank you.
applause like
Yeah.
that.
Thank you all.
Laura.
It was great to see all the familiar names. Thank you so much, everybody.
Great.